I've been camping all my life, but there was one trip that still haunts me to this day. It was back in the early 90s. My friends and I decided to spend the weekend in the woods. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway from the stresses of everyday life, but little did we know that it would become a nightmare. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon and set up our tents. The sun was starting to set, and the sky was turning a deep orange. It was a peaceful scene, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I brushed it off and told myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As night fell, we built a fire and sat around it, telling stories and joking around. But the silence was soon interrupted by a strange noise coming from the woods. It was this low, growling sound, like something was very angry. My friends were frightened, but I told them that it was probably just a coyote or a bear or some other type of wild animal. Now, a bear does freak me out, but they're usually afraid of humans if you make a lot of noise, so I wasn't too concerned about that. But then, the growling turned into a roar. It was like nothing I've ever heard before, and I couldn't help but feel like it was getting closer. I suggested we put out the fire and get into our tents, but my friends were too scared to move. The roar became louder, and I knew we had to do something. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking into the woods to see what was causing all of this noise. As I approached the source of the roar, I saw these two red eyes staring back at me. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. The creature, whatever it was, started to move closer, and I could see that it was getting bigger. I finally mustered up the courage to run back to the campsite and warn my friends. We quickly gathered all of our belongings and started running through the woods. I could hear the creature getting closer and closer. I knew we had to keep moving. Eventually, we came across a ranger station and sought refuge there. The ranger said, unofficially, there had been reports of some strange creatures in the area, but they've never been able to identify them. We stayed at the ranger station for the rest of the night, not daring to venture back into the woods. I couldn't shake the image of those red eyes staring back at me. It was like they were burned into my mind. The next morning, we decided to pack up and head home. As we were packing, I noticed something strange in the distance. It was a figure, but it was unlike anything I've ever seen. It was tall and lanky, and its skin looked like this sickly grayish white color. I could see that it had this strange head shape and these large claws. I told my friends to be quiet, and I pointed in the direction of the creature. We all watched it in horror as it started moving towards us. The ranger grabbed his gun and stepped in front of us, but the creature was too quick. It took off into the woods, and we never saw it again. We quickly left the woods and made our way back to civilization. We told people what we saw, but nobody ever believed us. They thought we were just making it up, and that we had too much to drink. I know what I saw, and it still haunts me to this day. The thought of those red eyes and that strange creature still sends shivers down my spine. I tried to find out more about what we saw, but there's never been any evidence or any official reports. It's been almost 30 years now, and the memory of that trip still haunts me to this day. I often wonder if that creature is still out there, lurking in the woods, waiting for its next unsuspecting prey. The thought of it keeps me up at night. I can never shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I tried to research what it could have been, but I've never found any answers. I've even gone back to the campsite a few times, hoping to catch a glimpse of it, but it's always been quiet and peaceful. But I know it's out there, waiting. I can never shake the feeling that I'm being followed. I often wonder if it's following me, waiting for me to return to the woods. I sometimes see shadows in the darkness, and all I can hear is that low growling sound, even when I'm not near the woods. I've told my story to anyone who will listen, hoping to find someone who has seen something similar, but I've never found anyone who has. I'm left with only memories and the fear that it will come for me one day. I've tried to move on, to forget about that trip, but it's just always there, lurking in the back of my mind. The thought of that creature and those red eyes watching me, they will never leave me. And so I'll continue to share my story, hoping that one day I'll find someone who can help me make sense of what I saw. Until then, I'll never be able to shake that fear that it's still out there, waiting. I need to share something with you, with all of you. I know it's going to sound unbelievable, like something you would see on the Sci-Fi Channel or a Stephen King novel, but it's true, all of it. I just wish I still had the proof. You see, 2 months ago, my father passed away, under very strange circumstances. My father worked for the United States government. The few times he spoke about it, he told me it was for the Department of Homeland Security, but I had my doubts. He lived a normal life, but there was a few times a year he would be gone for a full week or two. He's in his 50s, and he probably could have retired with a pension. But my mother passed away when I was young. I have no siblings, and I'm away at college full time. So I guess he didn't just want to be alone in an empty house all day. I'm the one who found him. He had slipped and fallen in the shower. He was dead when the paramedics arrived, and it was ruled a clear accident, only I know it wasn't. I found him in the shower of the main bathroom, the one connected to his bedroom. My father hasn't used that shower in the last 10 years. I mean, never. He was a tall guy, and the shower head came to his chest. He always used the guest bathroom to shower. Most of his stuff was even in there. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. Everyone just thought I was acting out in my grief. What could I do? I mean, I was grieving. I still am. I inherited the house and all of my father's belongings. During the winter break, I went home and began the emotionally taxing task of going through his stuff. Clothes, sporting gear, and some family photos. A lonesome Christmas tree came and went, and I was finally ready to tackle his office. That's where I found it. A false compartment in his desk. It was expertly hidden, and it wouldn't have been found unless moving the whole desk like I was trying to do. Inside that compartment was a small, locked briefcase made from some kind of material I didn't recognize. It was a combo lock, and after some thinking, I was able to crack it. It was a code that only me and my father would have known, and almost made me feel like he wanted me to find it. The documents I found were life-changing, really. Reports and pictures from NASA, Homeland Security, Air Force, and even some other government agencies are written in different languages, and all of them referred to the same thing: an alien civilization residing in the Proxima Centauri system. Yes, an actual race of space aliens who had created a society in one of the nearest star systems to our own. That alone was mind-boggling. But after reading more, I began to feel a deep despair come over me. The United States seemed to refer to them as simply the Proxima Alien Civilization, or PACs, as they were called in some of the more informal documents. The United States, along with Russia and China, had somehow received communications from this alien civilization in 1977, the WOW signal. I can only guess that after initial contact, the government stepped in and took things over from there. There were even more messages after that. It took 20 years, but eventually the messages and the signals were partially deciphered. I couldn't wrap my head around the technology they used, but the gist of all the messages was that a military armada had been dispatched from the PAC civilization, and that humanity had to vacate the planet or be destroyed. According to the estimates in some of the reports, it would take an armada roughly 50 years to reach our solar system. 2027, just 4 years from now. And I said, sci-fi movie. Apparently, the PACs have technology astoundingly superior to ours, even the ability to travel between star systems. make our nuclear capabilities seem pathetically insignificant. What's more, they seem to be capable of destroying a horrifically mass percentage of the world's population without causing any significant damage to Earth itself. It's unclear how they could do this and how the government knows this. Like any invader, they have a reason for coming. Water in liquid form, without much surprise, is one of the rarest resources in the known galaxy. It's also unclear how the PACs utilize the water, but they need it for some segments of their society to function. There were even some documents alluding to other civilizations besides the PACs that had already been destroyed. It was hard to choke down what I was reading, and I initially tried convincing myself it was just some weird work of fiction or some kind of hypothetical that the government was running. But I knew my father well and vaguely knew about his status with the government, and deep down, I know it's all true. I never thought that I would become the steward of this kind of information. I mean, I was in school for a business degree, for Christ's sake. The documents were important to my father, and I knew that I had to keep them safe. For what I didn't know, I rented a safety deposit box at a nearby bank and deposited the briefcase and records within. That was a mistake. I left them there alone for several weeks and went back to school. I came back for a personal matter, and while I was home, I decided to go take another look at those reports and try to decide what to do with them. They were gone. Other things I had left in the box, the deed to the house, and 2 of my father's watches were still there, but the briefcase and the documents were gone. I spoke with the bank, and they took the matter very seriously at first, but then they told me they wanted to show me some CCTV video. 2 weeks earlier, me, had come into the bank, shown my ID and credentials, and taken the documents from the deposit box. Only it wasn't me. Of course it wasn't. I was at school 2 states over. But again, my pleas fell on deaf ears. I mean, they had a video of it, so I guess I really couldn't blame them. Over the past week, I noticed 2 black SUVs following me, and on one occasion, a man in a dark suit approached me, asking if I knew my father. I left town and returned to school. I'm staying at a friend's house off campus, but I really don't know what my next move should be. I mean, without the documents themselves, who's going to believe me? Between 1949 and 1969, the United States military conducted 239 open-air tests of biological agents over certain highly populated cities like San Francisco, New York, and Panama City. This isn't a theory. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a fact that the United States government has admitted to. In 1994, it happened again. You can choose not to believe that, but in my life, it is a fact. And it happened again in 2008. 1994 is important to remember. 1994, Oakville, Washington. Important because so much of that incident was mirrored 14 years later. For 3 weeks, a mysterious gelatinous substance rained from the sky. It made people sick. Its origins were never understood. And when local organizations attempted to study the material that had fallen from their skies, their samples they harvested disappeared. This isn't a theory. This isn't a conspiracy. It's another fact. I've done my research. If you know something I don't, something that could explain my experiences, please feel free to chime in. Maybe I don't know everything. One thing I do know, however, is the summer of 2008. I was living in Comus, Utah at the time, scenic and rural. And for 3 weeks in Comus, we experienced that same rain. This time, the story was buried even more effectively than before. I was driving across town when the rain started. It landed on my windshield like globs of soured milk. I was confused at the time. I wasn't as familiar with the subject then as I am now. When I activated my windshield wipers, the white substance only smeared across the glass. I had to pull over and scrape the slime off my windshield by hand. I wrapped an old wrap around my palm and my fingers so that I wasn't making contact with the weird substance. As it turns out, that wasn't enough. I still got sick. A lot of people in Comus, Utah got sick that month. Infections mostly. A lot of us had it in our lungs. Others got it in their blood. We lost some livestock to the disease, and some families' lives were irreparably changed. For us, it was a new experience. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time they had to cover up something like this. I gathered some of the crystal-colored jelly into a mason jar the next time it rained. I wanted some proof of what was happening. I brought it to the local hospital for testing. I thought maybe, with a sample on hand, the staff would be able to more effectively treat the dozens of us who had wandered in sick. I was right, I think, and it would have helped things if it hadn't gone sideways. There were men from the FBI there, black suits and sunglasses. They must have been waiting for one of us to gather a sample, because the moment I dropped it off, they had me cornered in a hospital room answering questions. When I finally got out of that interrogation, the sample was gone. I imagine it was confiscated. The hospital could only tell me that it was lost. I made a mistake after that. I tried to go to the news. They wouldn't have heard me out anyway. We were right in the middle of Summer Olympics, and no one outside of Comus wanted to discuss anything else. Toxic rain wasn't exactly a story. It turns out I wouldn't even get the chance to find out. The FBI met me there. Again, they were waiting. Looking back, I wonder how many other members of Comus tried to say something to someone. I wonder how many of them were followed like I was. This time they took me into a van and threatened my life. They convinced me that if I breathed a word of what was happening in my hometown, that I'd incite a panic. I didn't exactly agree, but I wasn't in any place to argue. Besides, the prison time they said I'd earn if I went against their instructions wasn't worth the debate. They drove me home after that. They walked me all the way to my bed. When I woke up the next morning, thankfully, they were gone. My car was in the driveway outside. I'm not sure how they got it there, since the keys were still in my pocket. Slowly but surely, everything returned to normal. The rain stopped. The slime either dried up or washed away when a real storm came through. But the incident stuck with me. When I learned of what happened in Oakville in 1994, I couldn't help but see the frightening parallels. In that incident, somebody did have the opportunity to study the jelly. They said it was man-made. I wonder if that's what I could have been dealing with. Did the government purposefully release something over Comus that year? How could they keep it from spreading? I kept quiet for a long time. I figured I didn't have any choice. I didn't see any other reports of the mysterious white substance either. I'd figured the government had learned their lesson. They couldn't just experiment on their own people without being caught. Then I saw something in the news last year. Passaic, New Jersey, 2022. Hughes Lake turned completely white thanks to runoff from the nearby river. This time, their efforts were minimal. All they had to say was that the substance wasn't dangerous. They claimed that the river and the lake didn't intersect at all with the community's drinking water. A few comforting words and everybody stopped asking questions. But I realized that substance. I could tell that it was the same jelly I encountered. This time, poured into a river instead of across the sky. Sure enough, Passaic started reporting an outbreak of lung infections only 6 months later. It has to be connected, doesn't it? It's all too convenient. There are too many intersecting truths. Maybe they're testing something new, something with a longer incubation period. What do you think they're going to do with it? Hi, Donovan. Listening to your channel has inspired me to contribute this crazy experience I had when I was out in the desert. A few years back, some friends and I went on a road trip across the country, from Colorado to California. On the way back, we decided to spend a night camping in the Mojave National Preserve. Now, the Mojave National Preserve is a huge desert, located about 100 miles west of Las Vegas. Since we were college students without much money, we decided to spend a night there before continuing to the Grand Canyon the next morning. I did some research and found a camping area along the dirt roads close to the Kelso Dunes. They were at the southern end of the Mojave. I had heard about these sand dunes. I was reading that they made this wild booming sound that you could feel in your bones, like a vibration through your entire body. It said that you could produce the sound if you had a group of people on the top trying to shove as much sand as possible, like an avalanche. We arrived at the camping spot to check if there was a spot available for us. There was no reservation system. It was just first come, first serve. We only saw one campsite with no tent or vehicle, but there was a pile of wood fire and a 6-pack of warm beer that had apparently been sitting in the sun all day. There were no other obvious signs of occupancy, so we figured the place was available. We decided to set up our camp, and we began making dinner over a fire built with firewood left behind from the previous campers. When we were looking around the campsite, we found a really big pile of dried thin sticks and branches that were all interlaced together. There was a hole in the middle of it that seemed like a place that an animal would bury into. I kind of got this weird, creepy feeling from it that I just couldn't quite explain, but I did mention it to my friends. I couldn't see any reason why that would be weirding me out. The sun was starting to set, but my friends wanted to go up the sand dunes to take in the view and get some exercise after our long car ride. Initially, I was hesitant to join them since it was getting dark, and I knew that the dunes were taller and more challenging to climb than they seemed. I wanted to wait until morning, but they insisted, and I decided to go along with them rather than staying behind alone. We did make sure to take enough water and flashlights. Since we were experienced hikers, I figured we should be okay. There were a ton of stars, and the light sand made it easy to make our way up. It definitely took longer to reach the top of the dunes than we thought it would. By the time we got there, it was pitch black, but the view from the top was breathtaking, with the bright lights of Las Vegas shining in the distance, 100 miles away. And we were actually able to produce that same booming sound. It was incredible. We stayed up there for about an hour just geeking out over it. When we were walking back to the campsite, we noticed a fire in the distance. We thought it was another group that had set up camp further down the dirt road. We walked down the dune following our tracks, but they eventually became obscured, and we couldn't see the fire anymore as it was behind a series of smaller dunes. We got a little worried when we couldn't find the dirt road, but eventually we stumbled upon the end of it. I was happy to find the road, and even happier that we were only a mile away from our campsite. We walked along the road until we came across the campfire we saw earlier. My anxiety spiked when we got close to the source of the light and saw our van and tent partially lit by the flame. The fire was at our own campsite. We noticed someone lurking there. It looked like a very tall, lanky person. As we approached the campsite, I called out, "Hello?" But when we got closer, we saw that it wasn't a person at all. It saw us coming, and it crouched down on all fours. It was a hairless, skinny, pale gray humanoid creature with very long limbs. I know that sounds impossible, but we all saw it. It had pointy clawed fingers and toes. It turned its head towards us, and we could see sharp teeth and sunken eyes. It was sitting near the fire. I couldn't help it. I just screamed. I was so shocked at the sight of that thing, but it immediately stood up and ran off into the desert. We were all completely freaked out. There was no explanation for such a thing. We saw that nothing was disturbed or taken from the campsite, but there was no way we could stay there. What the hell could that thing be? We packed everything back in the van. We actually decided to drive around and see if we could spot it. We drove around with the high beams on, but we didn't see any sign of it. We got on the road and headed for the Grand Canyon without any explanation for what had happened. We spent the whole way speculating and trying to make sense out of what that could have been, but it was completely illogical. We were exhausted when we got to our destination and had to spend the whole day sleeping. That experience still haunts me to this day. When I think about it, it seems so unreal, but when I bring it up to my friends, there's no question that it happened. When I met my fiancée in college, I knew right away that I eventually wanted to get married. After we graduated, she moved to my town and got her own apartment. I had moved into a tiny place for the summer that I was helping to renovate in exchange for the rent. The town we lived in was relatively expensive, so she just rented a small one-bedroom apartment with a decent living room, kitchen, and a bathroom. After I finished working on the tiny house, I moved into her apartment with her. She had been there for about 3 months by then. A few weeks after moving in, I started realizing that the apartment, which was one of those 3-row houses, had its own quirks. I mean, it was across the street from a small old graveyard, but if anything, it seemed quite peaceful over there. There were strange cold spots in certain areas, without any apparent source of a draft, and the electrical system had some odd issues, such as lights flickering or turning off randomly. I attributed these anomalies to the age of the row house and its rather negligent landlord. It wasn't anything serious, but just kind of weird. But then, a while after that, strange things began to happen that left me feeling like I was being watched, or that someone else was in the apartment. Although I never felt scared or like something was malicious, I often thought I felt this strange presence. I wasn't prone to feelings like that. I was used to old houses, and I had grown up in an old Victorian that was over 100 years old. I sometimes caught glimpses of movement, but never actually saw what I'd call a ghost. This would typically happen when I was distracted or focusing on something else. One day, while I was chopping something in the kitchen, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. The living room door was located just to the left of the counter, and I saw something move quickly across the living room. Although I couldn't see anything specific, my peripheral vision caught the movement, and I suddenly felt like there was another actual person in the apartment. The feeling was so strong that I stopped working to go and check in the bedroom to see if my fiancée had come home early without me noticing. But there was no one there. I felt kind of foolish, but I even looked in the other rooms. Even though I could have sworn I saw somebody, I was completely alone in the apartment. Those weird little fleeting glimpses kept happening on and off until I was eventually kind of used to them. It helped that my fiancée was feeling it too. We had never really discussed how we felt about supernatural things or anything. We were both really practical people, but it started to feel like we were sharing this space with something. A few months after that, I was working in the basement. There was no room for a workshop in our apartment, so I set up a little space down there for my projects, between the furnace and the water heater. I would go down there when I got home from work to work on these wooden signs I was making for my side hustle. It was cramped, but it was better than nothing. That night when we went to bed, I noticed some light coming through the crack in the floorboards near the heating vent. I realized that I had forgotten to turn off the light on my workbench, so I got out of bed and went to the basement to turn it off. But as I started to walk back up the stairs from the basement, which was now dark, I felt this very intense sense of something telling me to leave. It was intensely creepy. I almost felt like I heard it speak, but I knew rationally that it hadn't been something actually audible. As soon as I felt that sensation, I was covered with goosebumps. I quickly ran up the basement stairs and went into the bedroom. My fiancée asked me why I had yelled, but I was confused because I didn't say anything to myself while I was in the basement, not even a whisper. My fiancée claimed that while I was coming up the stairs, she heard me scream loudly as if I was scared. She thought I had seen a big spider or something. This made me feel even stranger because I knew I didn't say a word, but she was sure that it was a person screaming and that it obviously had to be me. I couldn't really convince her otherwise, and we eventually just went to bed. I think it was probably about an hour later when we were both woken up by something aggressively trying to open the door. We were terrified that someone had broken into the house. We saw the door handle going up and down like crazy, and whoever it was kept knocking on the door harder and harder, but the door wasn't even locked. Then we heard this wail, like the saddest sound you could ever imagine. I picked up the lamp from my nightstand and yanked the door open. There was no one there. We were really shaken up and started talking about how it was probably time for us to move out of there. We still had 6 months left on the lease though. After that episode, we started investigating the history of the neighborhood more. Our investigation revealed that the property where our row home was located used to be occupied by an old church. This explained the presence of the old graveyard across from the row homes. The church had burned down a long time ago, and these homes had been built on the property. So, I believe that living in a house that was built on the site of a former church that had burned down, and having a graveyard close by, might have attracted a couple of restless souls. Hiking is one of my favorite pastimes, and I try to do it as often as I can. I especially enjoy distance hiking, where I cover a considerable amount of ground in one trip. It requires some dedication and planning, since I often have to make sacrifices in order to complete the hike. That could mean waking up before sunrise or staying out after dark, in order to maximize the number of miles I can cover in a single day. But hiking in the dark can be quite challenging, as it can be difficult to see what might be coming toward you. I've had several encounters where an animal has surprised me. Sometimes I feel pretty vulnerable, with only a tiny light to show me the way. But I keep doing it because it lets me see a different side of nature. I guess I've always felt the need to push my limits and overcome my fears. I have a strong bond with the wilderness, since I spent a lot of my childhood growing up here in the woods of Maine. I've spent plenty of time sleeping under the stars and exploring hundreds of miles of terrain. I just bring this up to stress that I'm just not a novice bumbling along in the forest. My most frightening experience occurred during a hiking trip at around 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first signs of morning light wouldn't be visible for another half hour or an hour. I was on my 5th mile of the trail and still had a long way to go. It was feeling a little eerie out there that morning. I was in a low-lying area, surrounded by steep ridges on both sides. The trail I was on was narrow and treacherous, covered in mud and hemmed in by dense underbrush, young maple trees, and an old oak growth. I was completely focused on the small light from my headlamp, taking one step at a time and completely zoned out. Suddenly, I heard a loud crack, and I stopped immediately. My heart was racing, and I listened for any signs of danger, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Almost always, 4:30 a.m. in the springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. I was in a tight enclosed space, and the lack of visibility made me nervous. I stood there for a long time trying to assess what I had just heard. I kept going, but then in the middle of a step, I suddenly stopped moving. When the fight or flight response is triggered, your mind is filled with intense, instinctual thoughts. The first thought that came to my mind as I stood there was that if I heard that noise again, I wanted to turn around and make a fast retreat back the way I had come. The sound I heard wasn't just a simple branch breaking or deadfall. It totally sounded like the sound was intentional. When I heard it the second time, I knew that it was time for me to leave the area. The sound was like a large wooden stick or a bat being violently hit against a smaller tree. I felt an urge to protect myself and get out of there as quickly as possible. The thought of having to retrace my steps through the dark, narrow trail and the dense underbrush didn't sound great, but I really wanted to avoid what was ahead of me. Then it came again, like 3 or 4 times in succession. It was just so sudden and violent. It sounded explosive. I had the impression that it was located about 50 yards ahead of me and to the left. At the same time, I got a sudden impression that I was being watched or even hunted. At that moment, I realized the full extent of my fear. I knew the direction of the sound and where the trail led. In about 30 yards, I would reach a sharp 180-degree turn and begin to climb the ridge, moving away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I mustered the courage to approach the noise, I would have to turn my back to it and start climbing the ridge, which made me really nervous. I started having these crazy thoughts. Several minutes went by and I just stood there breathing and listening. It had gotten eerily quiet again. The first light of dawn was still about 20 or 30 minutes away. I turned up the brightness of my headlamp and began to approach the 180-degree turn. The light from the headlamp was casting large moving shadows of tree branches onto the trail in front of me, making me freak out even more. I finally got to the turn and went around it, moving as quietly as I could, while I tried to listen closely. I was taking short, shallow breaths so I could focus on any sounds. Then, I caught a whiff of a smell that was indescribable. It was a scent that was wet and putrid and deathly. In the past, when I was a firefighter, I've encountered situations where human beings had passed away, and this odor was similar to that of decaying remains several days old, but with a strange twist. I kept moving, but what really pushed me forward was an incredible howl that suddenly erupted way too close to me. I forgot about being quiet and basically ran for my life. By the time I reached the top of the ridge, I was completely out of breath and scared out of my mind. All I could do was put in as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I didn't feel better until the sun was fully up and the birds were singing. I have heard and seen so many things in the woods, but that was the only one that made me really question some of my decisions. I'm a Suffolk County police officer in Long Island, New York. Something happened the other night. Well, let's just say I'm undergoing a psychic eval and assigned to desk duty indefinitely. I've been working the graveyard for the last few months, and I've just about started getting used to it. This stretch of the island is relatively peaceful, with minor drug activity, and the occasional DUI is about as exciting as it gets. Around 2 a.m., I received a call from a local about a suspicious vehicle parked near her home. She lived at one of the dead-end roads which leads to the bay, or Sound as it's more commonly known. This happened a few times a week, and usually it was a fisherman or a couple of teenagers up to, well, you know. Either way, the call had to be taken, and it was only a few minutes away. Getting some fresh salt air was a nice little bonus too. Arriving on the scene, I found a black Jeep with no occupants. You need a permit to park along certain stretches of the beach, and this was one of them. They didn't have it displayed, and technically, I could have left a violation and even gotten the vehicle towed, but that just wasn't my style. Chances are they were close by. I radioed in and walked down the short hill to the sand. Another officer was en route to provide backup, but I really wasn't sweating it. What's the worst that could happen? Looking up and down the beach, I thought I caught the soft glow of a campfire to the east, so I started heading in that direction. It wasn't far, maybe a few hundred yards, and the Sound is rocky, not sandy like the southern shore, so the going was difficult. When I got about 30 yards out from the now confirmed campfire, I called out identifying myself. No response. I was somewhat puzzled, as I didn't see anyone around, but someone had been here recently enough to keep the fire going. There was a chance they saw me coming and hightailed it out of there, but I didn't think so. The hill leading up away from the water was steep, and I hadn't made any noise during my approach. I called out again, and was this time greeted by a thunderous splash from far out in the water. The sound sent a jolt of fear through me. Whatever it was, it had to be enormous to make that kind of sound. I was reaching for my flashlight when an insistent whisper of, "Officer, don't," came from a shallow decline about a dozen feet away. Hand on my weapon, I walked towards the voice in a crouch and came upon a pair of teenagers in differing stages of undress. I don't know how I missed them the first go around, but as soon as I was alongside, the male motioned for me to get down. Being an officer, I was supposed to be the one to control the situation and giving direction, but something about the look on his face made me listen to him. I crouched down even further, stomach almost touching the ground. I asked them what in the hell they were doing, and what was going on. The girl frantically replied that there was something out in the water, and as if to capitalize on her fear, another massive splash sounded off. This time, it was much closer. Trying to calm my own panic, I told them both they needed to get up and follow me immediately back to the road. The boy went to stand, but the girl grabbed his arm, clutching him so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. That's when it happened. A final splash right alongside the water's edge was followed by this hissing noise that seemed to bounce off the hill behind me and hit my ears almost like a physical blow. Wide-eyed, the boy jumped to his feet, dragging the girl along with him. I was right behind them. The three of us started dashing up the beach in the direction my vehicle was parked. About 100 feet away, down at the water's edge, I could see an immense shape. I couldn't determine how long, but it was whipping back and forth like a slithering snake, and it was getting closer. In good shape, I quickly caught up with the pair. The girl wasn't wearing shoes, and the rocks must have been cutting into her feet. I ran alongside her and grabbed her free arm opposite of the boy, helping her along. Another hiss reverberated off the earth beside us, and a spray of sand kicked up and rained down on the back of our heads. I could hear its movement now. It was gaining quickly, and there was no way we would reach the road before it caught us. I yelled for them to keep going. I drew my firearm and I spun around. I was met with a frilled head like a cobra, 4 feet wide at least. A long scaled body ran behind it. The darkness of the beach and its rapid movements prevented me from determining its length, but if I had to guess, it was as long as a school bus. It was 40 feet away, 30, 20. Not stopping to consider the impossibility of what I was seeing, I raised my Glock and fired shot after shot at the thing. At least one must have struck, because it suddenly stopped its lightning-quick advance, reeling backward and letting out another, this time pained hiss. Its momentum halted. I took the opportunity to sprint away as quickly as I could. The couple wasn't too far ahead, and beyond them, I could just make out another figure heading my way. Throwing a quick glance over my shoulder, I could see the tail end of the creature entering the water, slinking away beneath the surface with barely a disturbance. I reunited with the couple, and we didn't come to a stop until reaching the fourth figure. The officers sent to back me up. I'll skip the confused explanations and recounting of the events. My sergeant was called to the scene, and ultimately my captain, who was off duty, was also called into the station to hear my tale. None of them believed me, even though the couple clearly corroborated my story. I honestly don't even know what happened to them. As I said, I'm undergoing psych eval, and I had to surrender my firearm until further notice. Honestly, I don't care what happens to me. I know what I saw. I know that it was an abnormal creature that shouldn't exist. But exist it does, and it's living in the waters around Long Island. I want to talk to you about something that I saw as a kid. My parents had a little ranch-style house on about 50 acres. Looking back, I have so many fond memories of the place. Nowadays, kids grow up with iPads and lack a sense of adventure. When I was a kid, every day was an adventure, exploring our property and all its wildlife and landscape. A lot of the land consisted of a massive lake that stretched as far as I could see. My fondest memories are of swimming in the lake, running around the fields, exploring the forests, then jumping back in the lake. Good times. I miss those days. Several times, however, I experienced some horrible things on that property. On one occasion, I had what I can only describe as a paranormal experience. There was this boat ramp that I loved to play at that was rarely used. There was a picnic table close to it, and I used to just spend all day running down the ramp, getting wet, and drying off on the picnic table. There were all kinds of turtles, fish, and other wildlife that would just hang out there with me. But on this day, there were no animals around at all. The lake was as quiet as I ever remember it being, and I was just doing my thing. I remember I was laying on the picnic table getting some sun, and I heard this weird gurgling noise coming from the water. It was almost as if someone was drowning in the lake. I ran over to the boat ramp and looked out to the water to see if I could see if it was turtles fighting or whatnot, but there was nothing there, and the noise had stopped. I went back to the picnic table and laid back down. Then I heard the noise again. I looked around, but I still didn't see anything. There was a silence again, so I closed my eyes to relax. Then I heard the gurgling once more. It sounded aggressive, more aggressive than before. It was like something was in the water growling at me. I didn't see anything, but I was freaked out enough to run home. I told my parents about it, and they told me that I did the right thing by leaving. A couple of hours later, I decided to head back to the picnic table to watch the sunset. When I got closer, I could make out someone standing by the boat ramp. I remember being slightly annoyed that I wasn't going to be able to watch the sunset by myself, but I made my way down anyway. The closer I got to the picnic table, however, something looked off about the person standing there. First, it was completely naked and gray. I snuck into the woods nearby to watch from a safe distance and slowly worked my way closer to whatever this thing was. The thing had scales all over its body and was just looking out at the water. Then suddenly, it slowly walked down the boat ramp and walked straight into the water until it was completely submerged. I watched it for a while, but it never re-emerged from the water. It then clicked, and I wondered if the creature was the source of that aggressive gurgling noise that I heard before. It absolutely terrified me once I put that together, and I ran back to the house. When I told my parents what had happened, they seemed concerned but didn't really give me a good explanation. However, I did overhear my dad on the phone later talking to someone saying, "It's back again," which disturbed me for a very long time. I remember that I barely slept that night, thinking about that horrifying creature. It took me several years to want to get back into the water after that, and I actually never returned to that boat ramp ever again. I mean, seriously, what the hell could that thing be? It was standing up on two legs and was taller than any full-grown man that I'd ever seen. I'll never forget that freaky gurgling noises. It was seriously like something from a horror film. Its scaly body was gross, and the way it just walked into the water, never coming up for air, I still can't explain it. I didn't see the front of it, but I can only imagine what kind of gnarly fish face it had. What if the creature had seen me watching from the woods? Would it have tried to eat me? Was it trying to talk to me with all that gurgling and growling? I've tried to research what it could have been, but most aquatic creatures I've been able to find don't exist, both in water and on land. I just see things like sea monsters, the Loch Ness Monster, giant squids, and those kind of things. But I know I can't be the only person who has seen something like this. There's so much about our lives and the universe we live in that we don't understand. I don't know who to turn to with this. I don't know who can help me understand what I saw that day. All I know is that to this day, it's still hard for me to get into any water, especially if it's not crystal clear. It was terrifying. That night was terrifying, and it changed me, I think. When you see something like that, something that you can't explain no matter how hard you try, no one believes you. And sometimes, you don't know what to believe either. You were certain what your eyes had seen. It's an awful feeling, so I don't ever talk about it anymore. You don't want people to think you're crazy or easily influenced. You don't want to seem gullible, so I don't know what to think. You start to feel crazy. I really started questioning my own sanity. That night I was training. I was a deputy in training. I was new, so in a lot of ways that night was already very hard. I had so many new responsibilities. I had to really be top-notch, not only for my own safety, but for the safety of others. And that was a heavy burden to bear. At that time, it felt exhilarating and exciting. But I later realized that it was just too much. Too much to be in charge when something that is out of your control happens. I remember vividly that we were sent into a diner. It was one of those pit stop places. It had a small gas station connected to it. There had been a complaint about a man in hysterics who had been disturbing the customers. When we arrived, the man was sitting in a booth. One of the restaurant staff had fixed him a cup of coffee. He seemed like he was in better shape based on what we were told. The man was really shaken up. He appeared to have been crying a bit. He claimed that something had taken his dog. Not someone, something. Let me make that clear. As soon as we started talking to him, he fell back into hysteria. He was speaking gibberish, something about light, something about the sky. That was about all we were able to get out of him at the time. My commanding officer had decided that it might be best if we took him with us to the station. We weren't sure who the man was. He had no identification, and we weren't sure if he was intoxicated or under the influence of anything else. And then there was the question of his sanity. By his appearance, he looked like he hadn't bathed in days. His hair looked very dirty, and so were his hands and face. Honestly, I pegged him for a drunk with nowhere to be. He didn't seem to be in his right state of mind. He seemed very crazy. So it was a lot. I felt really bad for him, but at the same time, I felt kind of disgusted by it too. I feel horrible for saying that. I just kept thinking, how do people end up this way? But we got him into our vehicle and we started driving towards the station. The man was muttering in the back of the squad car, but eventually fell silent. The area we were in was very small. It was a small town and it felt very desolate. It would take us a good 45 minutes or so to get back to the sheriff's office. So we were driving along the road and I start to look out towards the sky. It was nearing dusk, and I just remember thinking that I wanted to get out of the car and go home for the night because the man smelled so foul. But I just kept on gazing out the window. I didn't want to show how I was feeling. I felt guilty about my thoughts, really. At some point, I start to notice this really weird glowing light in the sky. It looked like a small fireball. It was round in a way, but it looked like it had this tail trailing off the back of it, and it was moving in the sky in a very unusual way. It didn't go in one direction. It went in several directions, side to side, up and down, diagonal at times. I hadn't seen anything like it before. It looked like it was dancing, sort of. And then the ball separated into 2 balls, then into 3 balls, then back into 1 ball. It was nuts. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I alerted my commanding officer, and that sent the unknown man off. Once he saw the things in the sky, he began throwing himself around in the car because he was trying desperately to get out of the vehicle. And just as quickly as the ball had appeared, it was gone. I started feeling very sick. I had the chills and I felt very fatigued. It was like I had a fever almost. My commanding officer seemed frantic at this point. I think he was upset about all what had transpired. Mostly, I think me getting sick was the tipping point for him. I'm not sure if he felt stressed because he didn't think I was able to handle the pressure, so it left a weight on him. But the rest of the night was awful. Eventually, I fainted, just completely blacked out. I don't remember getting to the station. I just remember being helped out of the car, and I was sent home to recover. I'm not sure what happened to that man. I decided to resign the following day. Between the shock of everything and the treatment that I had received that night, I just wanted to clean the slate. I'm not sure what the other officer had seen, or if he saw anything at all. It just felt very judgmental, the treatment I had received. I felt like everyone was looking at me like I was the crazy drunk. Like I was creating a scene and making people uncomfortable. Maybe it was karma. Maybe I was just getting a taste of my own medicine. But I was terrified, and that's as far as I'd like to go with it. I grew up going to the river with my dad. It was our weekend thing. Pack up Friday night, did an early start Saturday morning, spend all day fishing and just hanging out on the river. Whatever we caught, we'd have for Sunday supper. When I joined the Army, those fishing trips stopped, except for the times I went home on leave. My dad was the traditional kind of outdoorsman. He liked teaching me all the old stories he had heard from his father and grandfather. It wasn't just how to fish. It was how to get along with the water and the land. I just never realized how important all these old stories were going to be, until a lot later. It had been a few years since Dad was able to go fishing with me. but I kept up the tradition. Going out on the boat, feeling the water, fighting the oars as I rowed, because boat motors would scare the fish away, to my favorite fishing spot, feeling how life just slowed down when I was out there. Even if Dad wasn't always with me on these trips, I still liked them. I remember how cool the morning was that morning. The weather wasn't a shocker. It was early fall, not quite the end of fishing season where I live, and the fishing was still good. You just needed to know where the good spots were. Thanks to Dad, I did. So I put out my rowboat and I headed for some of our favorite places. The thing about doing things the old-fashioned way is that you can enjoy the experience more. The sounds of my paddling barely seemed to disturb the early morning mist that was still on the water. I didn't see anyone else taking advantage of the fishing, which surprised me a little. Our area had good hunting and a fishing culture going, and I was used to seeing other people on the river. But then I realized it was the start of hunting season too, and I thought maybe people would be a little more involved with that. I pulled out my spare baseball hat, the one that I use if I'm in the woods during hunting season. Fluorescent orange isn't what you would call a flattering color, but it's what you want to wear if you don't want to be mistaken for a deer or a rabbit. I had plenty of practice getting shot at while I was in the Army. I had no intention of catching a bullet after I'd retired. My dad's favorite fishing spot was a ways down the river, around the middle of a bend. It was always a great spot for largemouth bass, but lately we'd been catching catfish there too. That's a problem because catfish are invasive, and once they get big enough, they'll literally eat anything they can catch. My dad had a few stories told by his father of dogs and even children who had been snagged by the river's edge by a big catfish. I'd personally never seen one that big, but I'd seen plenty of videos on YouTube of people who had, and I never wanted to be on the receiving end of a monster catfish, at least not without my platoon in some serious firepower. The sun was all the way up by the time I made it to Dad's second favorite fishing spot. I was hoping for some decent fishing, and I was prepared to spend at least half the day getting him a good catch. He loved his fish suppers on the weekend. Mom swore it was one of the things that kept him young. I baited my line and dropped it over and waited and waited. Honestly, I waited a lot more than I was used to waiting before I ever got a bite. I know that sometimes even the perfect fishing spot comes up empty, but this felt a bit unusual. Maybe it was the weather, or maybe someone else had fished there recently. I don't know. All I know is that I only caught a couple of small fish, nothing really worth keeping. On any other weekend, I might have just taken my lousy catch and lived with it. But Dad hadn't been feeling all that great, and I wanted to bring him a good, fresh fish and tell him about my day on the river. So I decided to switch spots. I wasn't sure which of Dad's fishing spots I should pick, though. If his best was coming up short, there's no guarantee that any of the others would work out any better. I'd just have to try something different. I started rowing up the river, around the bend that my dad and I had never gone to before. Maybe it was the fall weather, but it seemed to me that the trees and the scrub on the left side of the river were more barren. Probably because they were taking the brunt of the wind. I kept my eye on the bank as I rowed. Something about it was nagging at me. Some of my dad's old stories came to mind. His father and his father's father had told him that they'd always have good luck fishing if they followed the rules of the river. I'm not sure how old the saying was, but my great-grandfather had talked about being wise to the spirits. They had their own section of the river that we should stay out of there. But in great need, we had to give our first catch to the spirits, so they know we respected them. It was a funny, archaic advice from an archaic time. And while I was all for conservation and respecting nature, my fishing luck had been garbage today. And if I finally did manage to catch anything worth keeping, I certainly wasn't planning on dumping it back into the river. I had to admit that the further I got around the river, the cooler the sunlight seemed to be, or the air seemed thicker. It was certainly quieter. I didn't even hear the usual fall insects buzzing around the surface of the water. And maybe it was my imagination, but it almost felt too still, like a storm was about to hit. I'd been a lover of the outdoors for a long time, but I'd never heard a storm hitting at this location at this time of year. so I decided to stick it out. I figured the lack of insects was going to be a good thing, that the fish were going to be hungry. I baited my line with a bit of leftover ham, always a winner when it came to catching anything worth cooking, and tossed it over. And then I waited. It was so quiet that I could hear the slash of the water against the hull of the boat. It was rhythmic and almost soothing. I kind of drifted off into that haze that comes whenever you're fishing alone. It wasn't the same as when I fished the upper part of the river. That had been a comfortable haze. This felt more like I was drunk, maybe drugged. I wasn't really paying attention to much. That's the biggest mistake you can make while you're fishing alone. Forgetting that you're alone, that there's nobody there to keep an eye on where the boat is drifting. My eyelids felt heavier and heavier, like I just wanted to close them and sleep, and it was hard to fight that off. But I knew I couldn't sleep, not now, not on an open boat on the river. Just then, there was a tug on my line, and that was enough to wake me up all the way. Whatever was on the hook, it wasn't a throwaway fish, and the way it fought me as I tried to reel it in made me wonder if it wasn't one of those big catfish. I could feel my adrenaline kick in as I fought to land my catch. It took a lot longer than I wanted it to, but I finally saw the ugly face of a catfish breach the surface of the roiled water when I felt something connect, hard, with the other side of the boat. The rowboat, not the most stable platform on a good day, flipped enough that I lost my balance and went headfirst into the water. The shock of the water made my breath punch right out of my chest. I've done my share of slogging through icy water before, but I was wearing fatigues and carrying 50 pounds of gear, and this was harder than that. I wasn't wearing anything other than civilian clothes, but they were incredibly heavy. No, not heavy. I felt things grabbing onto my legs, the back of my shirt. I actually felt thin fingers twist into my shirt just as I got pulled under the water. My training kicked in as the river closed in over my face. I wasn't sure how deep the river was, but I knew I needed to get to the bottom so I could push off. I let myself get dragged down until I felt something solid under my feet, then pushed hard. Whatever I was tangled with got pulled up with me, but I was able to get my head above water again. I flailed in the direction of the rowboat and managed to get my hand on the side. The weight on me intensified, and I got pulled under again, but I refused to let go of the boat. It rocked too much to pull myself up with, and I felt something heavy and cold and slimy slap into my fingers. I fought my way up to the surface for air, and only managed to tip the boat enough for the wriggling catfish I caught to fall out and back into the water. It slapped me in the face with its tail as it escaped into the river, but as soon as the fish hit the water, whatever was holding on to me just let go. As soon as they did, I swam back for the boat and struggled to get back into it. The oars had stayed in the oarlocks, and I'm not ashamed to say, I rowed for safety of the other part of the river. As I rowed, I got a good look at what I was leaving behind. There were things on the bank of the river, 5 of them. I don't know what they were. They were skinny and naked, and the only thing more terrifying than the way they were tearing into that big catfish was the face I saw when one of them looked up and watched me go. No nose, huge, glassy black eyes, and a gaping mouth, stuffed with a pale chunk of fish. Nothing I'd seen in Afghanistan terrified me as much as these things did. I rowed faster. I didn't want to be anywhere near that part of the river ever again. Once I got home and changed, I almost started to convince myself that I'd dreamed the whole thing, except there were finger-shaped holes in the back of my shirt. I don't know what I saw that day, but I'm also never going back to that section of the river, with or without company. And if I ever fish that river again, I am going to make very sure I give my first catch back to the river. I don't know that I'd be lucky enough to get away a second time. Something has been following me for 13 years, from 18 to 31. It's still following me. It's only a matter of time before I see it again. I'm not crazy, you know? I'm at least not the type of crazy that thinks this all sounds normal. I know it's weird, and I've tried to dismiss it. I've tried to say that it was a result of some childhood trauma, some memory I couldn't escape. I've tried to say it was a lack of sleep, or even a dream I couldn't wake up from. I wanted it to be a hallucination. I wanted it to be something I could treat with a change in routine or with the proper diagnosis. At least then I'd have a chance. A chance for what? I'm not sure. Why waste my time running from the inevitable? The first time I saw it was the worst, not because of the sighting itself, but because of what happened next. It was because I learned immediately that this thing was real. I was alone at first. I was sulking. It's easy to sulk at 18, isn't it? I moved from slouching in my chair by my TV and PlayStation to sprawling across my bed, expecting some form of entertainment to come to me. Hearing that, I'm sure you can understand why I wanted to dismiss this encounter as some image brought on by my depressed mental state. Then the room got cold. It was so cold so suddenly that I could see the breath in front of my face. I sat upright on the bed. Directly across from me was the only window in my room. It was a small, rectangular slab of glass, more like a vent than anything. I always figured that was the window I was stuck with, because my room, up on the second floor, was never meant to be occupied. Maybe it was for storage. Maybe it was a workshop of some kind. Maybe it was just an afterthought. That night, there was a man looking into my window. His face was pale, and his skin was taut, as if it stretched across his skull like a mask. There was a smile on his face so wide, I could see his gums and his cheeks. His eyes were large and surrounded by dark circles. There was a wide-brimmed hat on his head. Wiry, straw-like hair poked out from the sides of his head. The sight of this man was enough to make me freeze, to stand there and look in my window. He would have needed to be well over 12 feet tall. He didn't speak or move. He stared, and I stared back. What else could I do? Minutes passed, I think. It certainly felt like minutes, but time always seems to pass a little slower when you're scared. After those minutes, seconds, whatever, he did finally take a step back. He took a step back and faded out of my view. He returned into the darkness of the outside world. I wasn't sticking around to see if he had planned on coming back. Going outside may have been a stupid move, but I wasn't staying in that room any longer. I ran to my friend's house. We didn't even talk about the incident at first. I distracted myself with some food and video games. Eventually, though, I had to talk. I sat down on his couch and said that I needed to tell him something. He laughed nervously and asked if he could go first. I was too caught up in my own disbelief to notice that he had been acting strangely too. He told me earlier in the day, at his girlfriend's house, he saw someone watching him. As he described the white face and the same wide smile, I felt the color drain from my skin. He didn't have to ask. He knew right away that I'd seen the same man. We didn't talk about it anymore after that. If anything, we tried to forget. You know what they say about roaches. If you've seen one, it's already too late. You're infested. The one you find on your counter is nothing compared to the dozens running underneath your floorboards and hiding in your cabinets. That's probably true of any infestation, don't you think? Bed bugs, fleas. By the time you see them, you've already lost. Your home is theirs now. And without immediate professional help, you will be theirs too. So what if more than a home gets infested? That's the question that's been haunting me. What if a city, or a state, or even an entire country? Who are the professionals then? I can't stop asking those questions. I need answers. I've seen one, after all. And if I've seen one, there have to be others. I was in Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico. I was enjoying the occasional hike, and I still find the American Southwest to be beautiful. I don't think I'd go back out there alone, but the scenery is still gorgeous. I was outside of the caverns themselves. This was on the backcountry trail before it flooded. I'm sure that flood is the only reason more people haven't seen them. The creatures. It was midday, maybe a little after 1 p.m. I stopped to take a few pictures of the flora, when a sound further up the trail grabbed my attention. It was a snap. It wasn't the sound of a breaking bone or a snapping branch. It wasn't that ominous, It was just odd. It was like someone had cracked open a crab leg at the buffet table. I looked, saw nothing. There was a short ridge a little further up. I figured an animal had passed underneath it, just out of my sight. Then there was another snap. This one was punctuated by a wet squelching sound. I could easily visualize the man at the table, sweat on his brow and bib on his neck, stuffing his face full of steamed meat, chewing open and loud. But I didn't want to visualize. I didn't want to imagine. I crept closer to that ridge. It must have heard me coming, too. My boots on the sand must have sounded like a jackhammer to this thing. It was already looking up when I found it. It was looking right back at me. Its body was humanoid, gaunt and naked, the thinnest man you've ever saw. His limbs were long enough to make your skin crawl. His face and skin were smooth. It looked hard and reflected the sunlight, as if his body was covered in some sort of translucent shell, an exoskeleton or carapace. I don't know the word. I do know that the creature wasn't happy to see me. Its lips folded back almost mechanically, peeling 1 centimeter at a time. There were no teeth in its mouth. It looked like rows of pointed, hairy fingers, like a spider's jaw. Its eyes were so wide-set and large, it didn't have a nose. I don't think. No ears, no nose. It was rolling a piece of meat between its mouth fingers. I'd interrupt the thing in the middle of its meal. If I wasn't in trouble for stalking it, I certainly was for that. It lunged. It leaped the height of an 8-foot ridge with ease, swiping at my head with one of its long arms. I must have pulled back just in time. I turned around and ran. I was miles away from the nearest human being. I was even further away from my car. But what choice did I have? I kept running. I kept running even when I heard the wings, the electric flutter of beetles' wings, buzzing, like the drone of an airplane. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see. I could feel death behind me, and I wasn't brave enough to face it. Maybe if I had, I could describe the creature a little better. Maybe I'd know what it looked like in flight. Maybe I'd know how it disappeared. I tripped, crashed, and rolled onto my back. I brought up my forearms to shield my face from the claws I was certain were coming. I think I screamed, but death didn't come. For a reason I couldn't grasp then. The insect monster had retreated. It had spared me. I cried, and I crawled back into my vehicle. I tried to report the encounter. You can imagine how that went. Even when their eyes went wide with terror, they refused to believe me. I wonder if they'd heard a story like that before. A few weeks later, though, I did hear something interesting. A mother cougar was shot less than a mile from the place I had fallen on the trail. She had given birth nearby and was treating the area as her own. She was scaring tourists, even chased after one unlucky hiker. I wonder if I stumbled into her territory while I was running. I wonder if the creature chasing me knew that. If it knew he'd passed the threshold from his home and into hers. Is that why it turned around? In some bizarre way, had the cougar saved me? I like to think so. It makes sense to me, but it's also another reason for me to worry. If the presence of these natural predators is the only thing keeping the infestation at bay, what happens when those predators are gone? What happens to the mother lion when it is no longer there to protect her territory? Does the infestation creep closer and begin to sink into our worlds? I think what I saw that day was the first roach on the counter. It was the first sign of the things lurking underneath the floorboards of this world. And where there's one, there's many. I wish we could be prepared. I wish there was a trap we could set or an expert we could call. There's no exterminator for a job this big. Sooner rather than later, it's going to be us and the insects. They'll own our home, And then, well, you were listening, weren't you? This happened in the summer of 2007. I was a city worker for a town on the East Coast. I don't want to drop any names since this really isn't something I should be talking about. The town I worked for was a pretty big tourist destination in the summer and fall. We were near enough to the ocean to bring in quite a crowd for the summer months. There was a decent-sized lake on the edge of town that was a frequent destination for tourists. However, that year, there had been some strange sightings around the lake. The first reports were of giant birds sitting at the water's edge, preventing people from entering the lake. And then the story changed to bird men, like humanoid figures with wings. No one ever saw these things up close. They would describe the silhouette of the creature as either a giant bird or a birdman. In all the stories, the creature had yellow eyes, and it would block people from getting to the lake. Sometimes it wandered around the lake. Sometimes it stopped cars along the road to the lake. No one ever saw its face. It was so much of a problem that the police were called out to investigate multiple times. The logical theories were that it was either a large, territorial bird or some weirdo in a costume. The illogical theories were that it was either the Mothman, a bird-human hybrid, a ghost, or some kind of demon. I leaned towards the weirdo in a costume theory. That's what the two police officers thought as well when I talked to them about it. However, some further developments would take place that would make me change my tune entirely. It was getting late in the summer, and I had not seen the creature yet. The lake that was once a popular recreation area was practically empty. Whatever the creature was, it was doing a great job at scaring people away. It was terrible for the town that relied on the income from tourists, but I thought I'd use the opportunity to take my two kids to spend some time at the lake. It wasn't often that we could get the lake all to ourselves. It was about 3 p.m. when we left for the lake. Part of me wanted to see the creature because I was one of the few locals who hadn't. At this point, I was convinced it was some person in a costume, so I wanted to see just how believable the costume really was. It was deathly quiet when we got to the lake. That was the first thing I noticed. No sounds of birds, no frogs, no insects even. It was the strangest thing. I definitely felt like something was wrong, but it wasn't something I could quite put my finger on. I heard some rustling in the trees above me, but when I turned to look, there was nothing to be seen. I thought I saw a black shadow move past me, but I couldn't tell for certain. My kids just looked at me. They knew there was something going on here too, but they didn't say anything. We walked down to the edge of the lake, and that's when we saw it. The creature. It looked like the shape of a man, maybe 5-ish feet tall, and it had wings where its arms should be. The creature was entirely black, its face and its body. But that wasn't even the strangest part. It was standing in the middle of the lake, standing, like on the water, but it didn't have its wings raised. It was just standing there, like it was floating or something. I was so fixated on the creature that I didn't notice what was right in front of me. There were several dead fish floating in the water, and more fish washed up on the shore, and a few dead songbirds on the beach. There was something terribly wrong here. I took my kids and ran back to our car. We went out for ice cream and didn't say anything more about what we saw at the lake. But since I work for the city, I did some digging when I got to work on Monday. I went back to the lake with a couple of coworkers and we ran some water quality tests. We didn't see the creature that day, but I have no doubt it was there somewhere. And here's where it gets weird, as if it wasn't already weird enough. We found out that a local company was dumping some severely toxic waste in a river that fed into the lake. The pollution levels were off the charts, and it was poisoning the fish and wildlife population. It was a huge deal when the public found out, and it took a few years to finally restore the lake. The creature sightings continued to happen around the lake until the pollution was cleaned up. I don't know exactly what the Birdman was, but I'm pretty sure it was there to warn people to stay out of the water. It disappeared after the lake was cleaned up and restored, and it hasn't been seen since. I was hesitant to tell my story because it sounds crazy, but I hear other people having encounters like this. And I think these things aren't necessarily out to get us. They have some purpose, and if you ever see one, check your surroundings. It might be trying to tell you something. This happened in northwest Utah. I was set out by dispatch to investigate an incident with a wild animal at an old farmhouse. Not really my area, but we didn't have a local animal control in the county, so the job fell to me. The call came in the night before, but since it wasn't technically an emergency and no one was in danger, the station waited until the morning to send someone out. I reached the farmhouse at about 8:15 a.m. The woman who lived there was elderly. I'd say in her 70s if I had to guess. I don't recall her exact age. She lived alone in the house and the farm was no longer in use. The woman kept a few goats as pets, but that was about it. There were 3 buildings on the property besides the house. A large barn that sat directly opposite the house, a smaller barn next to it, and a lean-to situated perpendicular to the smaller barn. The goats were kept in the smaller barn. The other buildings were used for storage. The story she told me when I arrived was absolutely bizarre. She said the incident happened around 9 or 10 p.m. the night before, but she had been having problems before that for quite a while. She claimed her goats had been disappearing out of the pen at night. She couldn't figure it out. She had installed chicken wire on the inside of the fence to prevent any animals from getting under the boards, but the goats kept disappearing. It wouldn't be often. Maybe a couple of goats would go missing every month. There was no pattern to it and no signs of animals breaking in through the fence. She figured someone must have been stealing them, so she started putting them all inside the barn at night and locking the doors with chains and a padlock. When she began keeping the goats inside, they stopped disappearing. But other, stranger things began happening. She would hear knocking on the walls of her house and on the roof, like someone was trying to beat the walls down. But whenever she would go to investigate, the noises stopped. She said sometimes she would hear a screeching or screaming sound coming from outside, but never found its source. Last night, she heard the screeching sound again and went out onto the porch to investigate. She looked around, but didn't see anything at first. But then, a pair of eyes caught her attention. The woman said there was a giant bird-looking creature sitting atop the roof of the larger barn. She claimed it had to be about 5 to 6 feet tall and had a crest on its head and a very long, narrow beak. She said she knew that it was the creature responsible for killing her goats. Its eyes reflected back at her, and then it took flight. She said its wings were more like a bat than a bird. It had feathers, but it looked to have claws like a bat does. She said the creature flew straight towards her and she ran back inside the house and locked the door. She said she had never seen a bird like that in all her years of living out there. The creature rammed its body into the closed door. The woman said she was terribly frightened, but she wanted to know what it was, so she looked through the window next to the door. She said it looked reptilian, like a sort of flying lizard. It had feathers, but the eyes of a snake. I wasn't really sure what to do about this situation. This woman just described a dinosaur to me. I figured it was just a very large predatory bird, and maybe the woman's eyes weren't what they used to be. I recorded her story just as she told it. I did add a note that I thought it was likely a large vulture. She showed me the scratches on the door and the outside of the house, and there was substantial damage. I didn't have a good explanation for her, nor did I have a solution. She showed me the barn where the creature tried to break in. I asked if she had a gun because she's allowed to shoot any animal on her property that's threatening her livestock, whatever type of animal it turns out to be. I told her it might be a good idea to set up cameras to try to figure out what type of bird it was and go from there. What she really wanted was for someone to just get rid of the creature for her, but there wasn't much I could do about that. I did investigate the area around the goat pasture and the barn. If I hadn't gone out there, I would have written this incident off on the ramblings of a crazy old lady. I found a feather, just one. It was huge, like it belonged to an eagle or possibly something larger. The feather itself was red, with bits of yellow splattered in towards the stem. I bagged it for evidence. I told the woman I would send it out for testing and see what species it is. And that was that, or so I thought. I sent the feather out to be tested. It's not typically something we would do, but I was curious. It had been a month, and I hadn't heard anything about the feather. I asked my superior, and he told me the test came back as inconclusive. I did a bit of digging and called the lab myself. Now, here is where it gets weird. When I asked about the results of the feather and gave them the case number, they told me it was classified, and I didn't have clearance to get the results. The old woman called me at the station a few days later. She said a team of detectives had been out to her farm to follow up on the case, but they wouldn't give her any information. I didn't have anything else to tell her other than I believed her and to get something to protect herself and her goats if she planned on staying out there. I can't tell you what the creature was, but I do know there was a significant effort to cover it up. I was backpacking through the enchantments with 3 friends. The enchantments are in Washington's Cascade Mountains. Parts of the area are highly traveled, while other parts are pretty remote. We stopped in to talk to the park rangers before heading out. It seemed like a normal enough conversation, but they made sure to tell us to keep a clean camp and don't stray too far from the trail system. I thought the warnings were due to bears in the area, so I didn't think much of it at the time. We always had our food in bear canisters and took proper safety precautions. We didn't cook near our camp or anything like that. We began our trip, and I nearly forgot about our conversation with the rangers until we passed another group hiking out of the mountains. They were frightened, but didn't say why. One of the women stopped us and asked where we were going. She then said to make sure we clean up our campsites and don't start any fires. She said to use only our camp stoves, no fires. I asked if they had run into any bears, but the woman replied no bears, and then they left. None of us knew what to think about the encounter. There was something off about that group of hikers. If we knew what was good for us, we would have turned back at that moment, but we didn't. We kept hiking. I don't remember anything strange happening the first night, but the second night, we decided to have a small campfire. I thought back to the hikers we passed the previous day and the woman's warning about fire. The fire danger in the area was low. There had been a recent rainfall and the ground was still wet. Plus, we were out in the open in an area that was mostly large slabs of rock. There was no danger of the fire spreading. We had the fire going for less than 10 minutes before a rock suddenly flew into our camp. It was obviously thrown by someone. 2 of us shined our flashlights toward the area where the rock came from, but we couldn't see anything. We yelled out to them, but didn't get any response back. I thought I heard someone moving through the trees in the distance, but I couldn't be certain. All 3 of us got up and walked the perimeter of our camp. We didn't find anyone there. It was maybe 20 minutes before we all sat back down again, and within a second, another rock was thrown our way. This time, from a different direction. We tried to find the culprit. We even went so far as running into the woods after it, leaving our camp unattended. We stuck together in the forest, following the sounds of someone running ahead of us, though we couldn't see them. Whoever it was, they led us in circles. We would have been completely lost if not for my friend's GPS watch. You know, I don't think we would have made it back out of the woods if not for that. When we got back to camp, it was completely ransacked. Our stuff was strewn about everywhere, and the fire was extinguished. Upon further investigation, none of our belongings were missing. And I mean nothing at all. We had a decent amount of expensive gear, and none of it was stolen. Nothing was damaged either. It was just spread out across the rocks. There was no logical explanation for it. Even the food storage bags were intact. We ended up moving our camp in the dark that night to somewhere we hoped would be far enough away from the rogue rock thrower. Nothing else happened the rest of the night, or the night after. It was the night after that when we had the encounter, and it was the fire that drew it in. We kept our camp quiet the previous night. No fire. Looking back, that's why the creature didn't bother us. As soon as we started to build a fire pit, a stone came flying out of the forest. We hadn't even started the fire yet. The sun had begun to set, but it was light enough for me to see what threw the stone at us. It looked like a giant ape. It stood on 2 feet. It was covered in brown fur except for its face, hands, and feet. Its face was tan and its skin looked like stiff leather. Its eyes were brown and expressive, unlike any animal I had ever seen before. Its eyes looked like human eyes. It stood there, looking at me, with a rock in its hand. I immediately put the pieces together and kicked the fire pit apart. The beast dropped the rock it held in its hand as soon as I did. My friends and I all stood there dumbfounded, just staring at this thing. We couldn't believe it was real. It must have been following us this entire time. It didn't stay long, probably less than 5 minutes in total before it disappeared back into the trees. It was shocking how something so large could just vanish like that. We didn't build any more campfires for the rest of the trip. One of my friends wanted to lure it out with another fire to try to get a photo of it, but we ultimately decided against the idea. It was already throwing rocks at us. We didn't want to escalate any further. Still, to this day, I wonder why the creature hated fire so much. It didn't bother us when we used our camp stoves. Maybe it was afraid of us burning down the forest. I don't know. What I do know is that we share the earth with a lot more than just humans. I'm a state police officer in New Mexico, the proclaimed land of enchantment. I don't know if the name comes from the beautiful scenery or the sheer number of bizarre encounters people claim to have had. But in 7 years on the force, in 33 years of living here, I've never experienced anything until 2 weeks ago. New Mexico is made up of small pockets of civilization, divided by hundreds upon hundreds of miles of vast nothingness. The odd town or ranch breaks up the landscape, but for the most part, it's just empty plainlands and mountains. There's also reservations. For the most part, we stay out of them. They typically have their own tribal police who do all of their own policing and law enforcement. But on the odd occasion, we have contact, and this is what happened on that night. A vehicle escaped pursuit earlier in the day and was believed to be headed into territory directly bordering a reservation, which I won't name. I have no desire to disrupt their everyday life. The vehicle was believed to be involved in drug activity, and the officer chasing them had wrecked in the pursuit. Fortunately, the officer was only lightly injured. But I was the next closest unit in the area and was ordered to respond. Approaching the reservation, I contacted the tribal police as a form of courtesy. They agreed to aid in search and sent one of their own officers to back me up. We'll call him Jake. Once meeting, we both agreed to ride in his vehicle, which was more suited to the off-road terrain we expected to tackle. The search didn't last very long. We found the vehicle left abandoned, about half a mile outside of the reservation. Keys still in the ignition and still running. The window had been busted in, and shards of glass littered the driver's seat and floor. The jagged remnants of glass were coated with blood, and a trail led into the darkness. My tribal companion sniffed the air, which I found strange, and then asked to be excused for a moment. As he was walking away, I noticed him pull a radio out of one of his pockets. Not the police-issued one he had strapped to his chest, but rather a small cheap one, like you would buy at Walmart. He walked nearly out of earshot, and I could only catch snippets of the conversation, spoken in what I assumed to be his people's language. While I was waiting for him to return, I searched the vehicle and unsurprisingly found a substantial amount of crystal methamphetamine in the trunk, as well as a loaded handgun with the serial number filed off. No wonder he ran, and if he was high at the time, it might explain the erratic behavior of busting through the window. My temporary ally returned, and we decided to follow the trail of blood and find the suspect. My backup probably wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes or so, and if the suspect was bleeding this bad, we had to get him out before he completely bled out. Even criminals have the right to live. We tread off into the night, my companion leading the way. The blood trail quickly thinned. Maybe the perp had performed some self-administered first aid. This didn't seem to hinder Jake though, his flashlight searching back and forth on the ground as he kept a steady pace and seemed confident in his navigation. We had gone maybe half a mile when we heard a noise pierce in the desert air, a human scream and one of immense pain. We paused in our tracks as we heard the scream fade only to be followed by another, even more fear-laced wail of agony. My partner went into a full sprint, headed in the direction of the scream. My sense of duty bade me to follow him, and I did. We arrived upon a scene of carnage. We found the man, abandoned in the section of a dried-out riverbed, what was left of him. He was missing from the hip up. Jake drew his pistol and shouted something in the darkness surrounding us. It sounded like a challenge, and it was met with a deep, wet, throaty growl. Out of the darkness leapt a shape so black, it seemed to devour any light that touched it. It landed square on Jake's back, and he went down hard, slamming his head on a rock during his fall. This was no creature I had ever heard of, and I was momentarily stricken with fear. My training quickly snapped in, and I drew my own firearm, snapping off 3 shots into the massive shadow. It was too dark to see, but I know my rounds found purchase because the roar of agony was let out from the beast. It leapt from Jake's back, soaring an impossible 30 feet away, and came to a stop. A cloud of dust kicked up where it landed. I was trembling so hard, I was afraid I might shoot myself, but I still fired the remainder of my clip into the dust cloud, this time with no responsive pain. Hearing the click was the biggest "oh shit" moment of my life. I widened my stance to brace for the attack, but knew it to be futile. Then I heard shouts coming from behind me. 2 men ran past on each side, firing rifles into the fading dust cloud, and they hit. An even louder eruption of agony poured from the shadow. I heard a sort of chanting behind me and looked over my shoulder to see a Native American in full ceremonial regalia, holding a short staff of wood and shouting something at the creature. Looking back, the creature began dissolving into some form of cloud, and tendrils of black smoke dissipated in the night air. 2 of the men rushed to Jake to revive him. He was alive and miraculously only lightly harmed. The other men, including the man who had been chanting, spoke with me for several moments, ensuring I was uninjured, and then disappeared back into the desert. With Jake now awake, the men escorted us back to where we had left our vehicle. I could see flashing lights coming from the highway and knew they were officers from my own department. Before they arrived, Jake dismissed the 2 men and talked to me. He told me to tell my department that it was a mountain lion that had attacked the man. The man, in some erratic rage, had busted through his window, and the cougar had taken advantage of a wounded prey to catch an easy meal. He asked me what my superiors would think of me if I told them the truth. He was right. I didn't even know what happened enough to explain to anyone, and trying to do so would probably catch me in some kind of psychological evaluation. I agreed to give Jake's version. It was believable enough, and it wouldn't raise too many questions. So that's what I did. I lied, and my department was happy enough to have another violent drug dealer off the street. They didn't really care how it happened. Jake invited me to come back to the reservation one day, and he would explain everything that had happened that night, what that thing was. Honestly, I'm not sure I'll go back. Sometimes it's better just not knowing. I used to be a homicide detective in Philadelphia, PA. I say used to because I'm retired and have been for some years. The city isn't what it used to be. Sure, we had our share of problems in the early 90s. The city was still struggling with the crack epidemic that swept the East Coast, and the homicide rate was at an all-time high. Most of the murders, about 400 a year, were driven by drugs and gang violence. Or so we first thought. I remember my first incident with one of the creatures, or rather the carnage caused by one. It was a rundown crack house in the Badlands of Kensington. Even before today's open-air drug market, it was still no place you wanted to ever visit. And when we went in, we did so in force. We got the call that there was a homicide with unusual circumstances. What an understatement. The scene consisted of 3 dead bodies, 2 male and 1 female. It was unclear how the call had come through, as there were no witnesses when the first patrol car arrived. These situations were overdoses 99 out of 100 times, and I had a feeling some rookie probably overreacted as seeing his first stiff. He didn't. Stepping into the entryway, I could immediately tell that the officer had been right to call it in the way he did. 3 bodies, torn nearly to ribbons, scattered across several rooms in the house. No human, no matter how cracked up they were, would be able to cause a massacre like this. Forensics was called, and while they did their thing, we searched the rest of the house. The search turned up an oddity in the basement. It was an old house built in the early 40s and not maintained or kept up with. A portion of the concrete wall had caved in, and a narrow tunnel leading into the earth, maybe 2 feet wide. A splatter of blood ran up the wall and into the hole. We didn't have any equipment they do today, so there was no way to prove it, but it was evident that something had dug the hole with intent. Catching back up with forensics, they informed us that the bodies were not wholly present. Several limbs and extremities were missing, nowhere to be found. There was no more information to be had, and there was no chance anyone in the neighborhood was going to talk. It was unexplainable and horrible as it is, but we were happy to put it behind us. 5 more attacks over the next 3 weeks. Same MO. Low-key people, the homeless, the drug addicts, immigrants, the type of people nobody would miss. Forgive me, my perspective has changed considerably over the years, but this is just how it was then. The commissioner at the time formed a classified task force, and a representative from some government agency attended, but never got his name or title. What he told us, well, it still brings back tension in my stomach when I think about it. Eaters, they call them. Not very original, but certainly on the nose. There was next to no information on them, besides a specimen that had been killed and taken recently in Boston. 5 foot head to toe, greenish-gray skin with a rubbery texture, 3 protractile talons on each hand, and 3 rows of razor-thin teeth lined the inside of a wide mouth. No ears, eyes, or nose could be identified, and the organic composition of the creature was wholly alien to anything science had seen. Across cities on the East Coast, these creatures had been making appearances and slaughtering people in the same manner. Boston, New York, Baltimore, Newark, and right here in Philadelphia. Each scene of the attack was in the vicinity of one of those same holes we discovered in the basement. The deepest they had been able to probe in one of those holes was 500 feet, and from what they could tell, it went significantly deeper than that. You could imagine hearing all of this, something out of a goddamn sci-fi movie. But there it was, laid out before us. I and 9 other veteran detectives were assigned to this clandestine task force. Our sole responsibility was to monitor and respond to any activities of these abominations from under the earth. And so began a 2-year-long war that the people of Philadelphia had no idea was being waged. The attacks continued in the same format as before, in quiet locations, back alleys, and under bridges. We even suspected some kind of aquatic capabilities, due to the sheer number of victims found along the banks of the Schuylkill. The attacks and deaths, when they were reported, were skewed to seem like it was a typical murder. Some of the other DTs had encounters, and we'd even lost one early on. In those 2 years, I only came up against one. The details are just too much for me to recall in detail. Suffice to say that I'm still alive to write this. Those few moments of terror will live with me until the very last. Toward the end of the 2nd year, the number of instances had begun to slow down. We had communicated with other cities via the same government representative that had been at our briefing. The story was the same everywhere, fewer attacks and less violent than typical. Some with single piercings to an artery or a broken neck. They could have easily passed for the work of a human. There had even been a few survivors. I'm afraid of what likely happened to them. Then, in the winter of 1999, the attacks ceased altogether. All across the East Coast, hostilities had come to a complete stop, not so much as a sighting anywhere. The task force remained for several more months until eventually being disbanded for inactivity. It was explained to me in no uncertain terms what the repercussions would be if I ever divulged any of this to anyone, ever. And that's where I've let it lie for over 20 years. But I just can't anymore. I see my grandkids running around, and I just can't continue holding on to this information. What if they come back? What if they're just hibernating? Or that had been an advance party for some kind of larger scale invasion? There is this building across the street from me that I can see every day from my office. The building is completely unmarked, except there's a logo of a goat's head located on the front gate. I often feel uneasy when I look at the building, as if there's something inherently wrong with it. I remember when I first got the office. When I got promoted, I was so excited to have a large office with a view of the city. Immediately, when I looked at that building, however, something didn't feel right about it. Many things have always disturbed me about it, but recently, I think I discovered the true sinister purpose of this place. I should mention I've been working for my company for about 15 years. The buildings across the street have been there the entire time. Since then, I've noticed several disturbing things about this place. I would love to sneak in there with a camera and expose the true nature of it. But I have a family, and my days of being a martyr are well behind me. The first thing I noticed about the building is that occasionally I would see a car or a van pull in there, but never, not once in 3 years, have I ever seen anybody come out of that building. I'll be honest, there have been days where I barely did a lick of work, and I just spied on this building all day. Something has been very off for quite some time, and I've been trying to figure it out. The first person I ever saw go into the building had a black cloak. I didn't think too much about it at the time, but every single person I've seen go into that building has worn a black cloak. The cloaks have hoods and cover the people up completely from head to toe, and they all appear to wear the same exact style cloak. There's a reasonable explanation for this, but I've never seen anyone wear a cloak as a uniform, especially a black one with a hood. One day that it was raining, I tried to tell myself that they wear them to keep dry in the rain, but that's the only thing they ever wear. One time, I worked until late at night and saw 5 cloaked people over there in a circle. There was this red writing on the ground, and they all took turns reading from a book. They then entered the building in a single file. I stayed later, waiting for them to come out. Around 3 a.m., I fell asleep at my office, and I have no idea if they ever left or not. I'm guessing probably not. It gets more disturbing. Almost always, there are small dead animals at the entrance of the gate. I've never seen anybody put them there, and I've never seen any living animals die there. Every morning when I look, though, there are more dead animals there. There will be birds, rabbits, mice, and snakes lying right there at the gate. At first, I thought the gate must be electric, and that's what's killing the animals. Sometimes I take my lunch break at a cafe around the corner, just so I have an excuse to take a closer look without causing suspicion. I've touched the gate every time I've passed by, and I've never gotten shocked. There are also no markings indicating electrical hazard that would be required if it was an electric gate. I don't remember the last time I didn't see something dead laying there. Recently, a few dead animals have started appearing at the entrance of our building as well. Just a few here and there. I haven't mentioned anything to anyone at my work because I fear being called crazy. But part of me wonders if they're sending a message to me. Maybe they've seen me spying on them. Maybe the animals are used in conjuring up curses and they've cursed me and my workplace. That and the black cloaks alone give me the creeps. Sometimes at night, the window of the top floor glows a strange red color, and I wonder if this must be some sort of unholy ritual. Could this be where they sacrifice the small animals? Are small animals the only thing they are sacrificing? There are often weird symbols spray painted on the sidewalk. The office isn't located in the best area. It's on the fringes of town, which is why all the strangeness doesn't get much attention. Basically just from me, who is hyper aware and watching like crazy. So I always figured it was just someone messing around or a gang making their territory. But now I think that the members of the building are responsible for these symbols. I'm not an expert on the occult or demonology, but one of the symbols is a pentagram, and I know that's often used in dark magic. I don't recognize the other symbols, but it's in a similar style, so I strongly believe they're symbols for something sinister and evil. The thing that has freaked me out the most about this place happened just a couple of days ago. A black van pulled into their parking lot, and 5 cloaked men got out. They opened the back, and it took all 6 of them to pick up something from the back. I can't be entirely sure, but from my angle, it looked like a coffin. They carried it over their shoulders and into the building. The van pulled around the building, and I haven't seen it or the cloaked man leave since. Was this a human sacrifice? I know I'm thinking too much. It's affecting my family life, it's affecting my work, it's affecting my mental state. But I get nauseous when I think about what must be going inside that building. I hope I'm just being paranoid, but I know I'm not. I can't talk to anybody at work about it, and I can't talk to my family about it. I also don't want to tell the police, because I don't want to bring the attention onto myself. It just feels a little too dangerous. I feel stuck, and I hope I don't become a victim of their wicked religion. What should I do?